Hi, it's Alison from Ancestral Kitchen here. Today I want to talk to you about fermented gingerbread. And in this video I'm going to be talking about what it is, how to make it. I'm going to walk you through the steps to get started, and then I'm going to be cutting to a live Zoom I did where I baked up two types of fermented gingerbread. The first one was a kind of traditional crunchy gingerbread cookie, and the second one was a French style pain d'épices, which is squidgy, more like a bread. The recipes for both of these will be underneath the video, so don't worry about taking any notes. So first of all, what is fermented gingerbread? So later on in the video I will explain more the traditions around these two examples of it. Now I want to talk to you about the practicalities. The method to make these was inspired by gingerbreads that have been made and fermented or matured in Europe for many centuries. And this method has two distinct phases. The first one you do sometime before you want to make your gingerbread, ideally a few months before, and you mix up a dough and you leave it somewhere to mature. If you don't have a couple of months before you want to make the cookies, you can do it closer, but you ideally and historically would leave it a bit longer. The second phase is the baking, which is actually when you want to have the cookies, when you want to eat them, and you take that dough that's been somewhere cold and you mix it with other ingredients and bake up either it into a bread or into a cookie. So you'll see the second step of that, the making of the dough into the actual end product, in the later part of this video. For now, I want to show you how to create that initial dough. So what you need to do is mix up a dough which is equal weight flour and liquid sweetener. Let me show you here. So I'm using spelt flour, but you could use wheat, rye, gluten-free, any type of flour. Here I have 250 grams, and to that I'm going to add the same amount of sweetener. This is honey, but you could use honey, you could use molasses, you could use any other liquid sweetener, or you could mix it up and have some of each. And what you do is take your sweetener and put it in with your flour. Now, not all honeys are as runny as this one. This is a local honey, and if you have trouble with mixing your dough or with getting your honey even into your bowl like this, you can heat up the honey very, very gently over boiling water in a bain-marie to make it more liquidy, and that will make this process of bringing these two things together a little bit easier for you. I just want to get the last of my honey out. I don't like leaving anything behind. Okay, and then what I found is it's usually best to start with a spoon, and then once this is mixed in a little bit I will swap to my hands and get a bit messy. Let's move that out of the way. It doesn't have to be raw honey. This is a raw honey, but it doesn't have to be. I've made it with both raw honey and pasteurised honey, and both work well. And if you want to use molasses, I've used a blackstrap molasses only as part of it, because blackstrap molasses is really can be quite strong, and that flavour will come through in the gingerbread that you make. So I get it to about this consistency, you can see there. And then I'm going to clean off my spoon, which is mucky from the honey, like so. And then I'm going to put my hands in, and I'm going to bring it together using my hands. So once this is mixed up, you cover it loosely, and then you leave it somewhere cool. Depending on where you are in the world and what time of year it is, that might be in a fridge. But ideally it would be a little bit warmer than that. I leave mine in the coolest part of the house. I generally make this during winter for Christmas. And I leave it downstairs in the coolest part of the house. And historically it was left for months like this. And ideally you would do that to make your gingerbread, because the flavours really develop beautifully and the dough matures or ferments. If you don't have that length of time available, if you want to make a gingerbread and you want to make it for Christmas and you've only got a few weeks to go, don't let that put you off, because even just a couple of days of this sitting, allowing it to merge together and those flavours to mould together will be beneficial. So in the video that follows after this, you'll see me using a base like this and adding spices and a little bit of fat to make the gingerbread cookie that I showed you at the beginning of the video. You'll also see me using another dough, which I mixed up just like this, but I used whole grain rye flour instead of spelt, and I used honey plus molasses. I think I used 3 parts honey to 1 part molasses. And I used that one to make a French style pain d'épices, and pain d'épices is spice bread in French. And again, like I said at the beginning, all the recipes are in the notes under the video. So we're almost done here. You can see it's quite tough, and it will get tougher. Don't worry if your dough turns into a kind of a brick. That's how it should be. Okay, so I'm going to scrape this round now, put it in another container, a cleaner container, and then I'm going to cover it loosely with a bit of muslin, and I'm going to tuck it away for cookies in a few months. Enjoy watching the rest of the video, and let me know if you bake this up. Either you can leave a comment below, or you can contact me on Instagram, where my handle is ancestral_kitchen. Enjoy your gingerbread. So I'm going to start with the cookies, I think. And first of all, I'll just show you one of my finished ones, which is here. So this is a kind of a Lebkuchen-style cookie. I'll say style, you'll find out later how I kind of did it differently. And I've topped this one with some homemade 100% cacao chocolate, which I make from beans here, and a little bit of orange. And when I kind of approached this and started doing some research, it became clear to me that spiced honeyed cookies have been made all over the world for many, many, many centuries. And there are thousands of recipes. There are hundreds online. There are probably thousands of recipes for how to create them. And the research that I did kind of led back to China. And there's a Chinese honey bread called Mekong. I don't know how you pronounce it, but it looks like Mekong. And the history books kind of say that it was brought back to Europe via the Crusades, and then it was handed through the monasteries and various other places, and became a different type of thing in lots of different places. Also, there's research saying that the Egyptians used spiced honey cake, and we know the Egyptians did things really, really well, so they've got a tradition as well. Honey was particularly favoured because it was thought of as magical, because it was so sweet, and sweetness really wasn't around in the past like it is now, and also because of its healing powers. I mean, all of us know how honey is an antibacterial, everything, and really, really good for you. And what things like Manuka honey actually are used as medicine. So honey was treated as something really quite special, and therefore these cookies or breads were something special, because honey was an expensive ingredient, a magical ingredient, and a healthy ingredient. So to make these cookies, they were kind of based on the Lebkuchen, but when I started researching Lebkuchen, what I found out was there are hundreds of recipes for Lebkuchen as well. And some of them have eggs, some of them are glazed, some of them are thin, some of them are thick, some of them have nuts, some of them are basically all nuts and fruit with just a bit of flour to bind them. And so really it seems like it's a free-for-all. Do what suits you. That's what I took it. Do what you want to do. Do what you want to eat. And from my perspective, my son doesn't eat eggs. And so I was just like, right, I don't want to put eggs in. And I saw that on the recipe on the Sandor site said these older style raising agents, and I didn't want to get into trying finding those. So I just used baking powder, which is the kind of the double one that's got the acid and the catalyst in it. And I also didn't want to put any dairy in, because I'm not sure whether my son's got a dairy issue. So I just wanted to keep them eggs and dairy free. So what I did, I'll bring my dough in here and kind of show you. I think I can move this down and show you the dough. So my dough was spelt flour, because I absolutely love spelt. and it's grown here locally. And I mixed it up with honey, chestnut honey, because that's a local honey that's very prevalent here. Chestnuts are grown in the region that I'm in, and chestnut honey is everywhere. So, and chestnut honey, if you ever get to taste this chestnut honey and you haven't, try to, because it's so beautiful. It's dark, it's such an intense flavour, and it goes really well with the spelt. So I put those two together and left those. And we'll put the handout that Annie referred to is where we've written up what we've done, each of us, and it's got all of the details in there. So everything that I'll show you for this and my bread, you don't need to worry about writing it down because the details are in the handout. So this is 250 grams of dough. And I just wanted to keep it as simple as possible. No eggs, no dairy, just as simple as possible as I could to actually make a dough. So I've pre-prepared my spices here. These are my spices. And I've got in here cloves, cinnamon, allspice, nutmeg, anise, ginger. I also put my baking powder in here and a bit of salt. I like to use most of my spices whole and grind them in a coffee grinder because then I can keep them for longer, but also they taste better. So this is the spices that I'm going to put with this amount of dough. Again, the details are in my handout. And then I did one recipe with no fat, one attempt with no fat, and one attempt with fat. And I tasted, or I didn't taste them actually. My partner tasted them, my son tasted them on different days to see which ones we preferred. And definitely, we all agreed that the ones with the fat were nicer in that they were less ridiculously hard at the beginning, and they were less kind of dusty, and they held together better. So because I didn't want to use dairy, I'm using lard, which is from local pigs that I rendered myself. I'm just going to take my watch off. And I'm going to actually mix this so you can see it, because it's really simple, basically. I'm going to stand up and put the camera down, and then hopefully, if I swap to this other camera, I can see if you can see me, hopefully. There we go. Okay, move my pad out of the way. So this is my spelt and honey here, and I'm just going to flatten it out. It is sticky. It really is sticky, but it worked. And I'll show you just very briefly how I roll it. So that's my dough, and I'm just sprinkling on all the spices that I ground, and my baking powder and my salt is in there. And then this is my lard. That's going in. And then all I needed to do when I did this last time was put a tiny bit of water in it, and I was able to just work it with my hands and make a pliable dough. What I tend to do first is not bother about the water, because if I put too much water in, it's not salvageable very easily, because I don't want to put extra flour in. But if I need some water in a minute, I shall put it in. And I'm just getting my hands really messy and working it round. It's really interesting to hear Annie say that one, she used turmeric, because I love turmeric. Yeah, lardy cake, you're right. I love turmeric, but I never would have thought of putting it in this, because I tend to think of turmeric as a savoury spice. And also the Nigella seeds. I absolutely adore Nigella seeds. And I use them in dressings, I use them in rice, I use them in bread, I use them in cooking lentils. I love their flavour, but I would never have thought of putting them in cookie. So I'm actually interested. Annie, if you have the chance, what does the Nigella taste like in the cookie?
Well, can you hear me? It tastes.
Yeah, I can.
It tastes a little bit acidic and kind of it's like kind of mysterious. Like, what is that taste? I wonder how I could give you all the recipe for the turmeric cake in that book, because that's an incredible combination of flavors. Also with almonds. I think Yeah, I think it's like it's almost like you can't place something in the onion family if it's not savory. That's what I'd say about
Yeah.
the Nigella seeds.
Thank you. Thank you. I've seen a couple of comments come up about the dough being hard. So when I took this out of my stash that was had been fermenting for 2 months, it was really hard. And you can see I've literally been doing this to it for about a minute now. There is the option of taking your hard dough and putting it in a bowl of water above a bowl above a simmering saucepan of water. So like a bain-marie. And that makes this much softer. And then you can work it. What I would say is to be careful if you do that, because if it gets too hot, it goes kind of into just a cake batter. And then it's hard to work it into a position where you can roll it. So you could heat it very lightly to make it softer. But the heat of my hands and this lard, this is a workable dough now.
Well, I overheated, and that was my problem with the nonettes, by the way, because I did use the bain-marie approach.
And what happened when you overheated it, Annie?
It kind of it got too battery, and also it was so sticky I didn't know what to do with it, and then some of the flour actually congealed in a funny way.
Yeah, that's kind of what happened when I tried heating some for the second recipe that I'm going to show, and it just got really incredibly sticky, and it was sticking onto all the spoons and everything else, and I really didn't know what to do with it. So that's just be careful. That's what I said. Okay, so I'm going to flour my board now. Sometimes with gingerbread, I roll it out between 2 pieces of greaseproof paper, and I was ready to do that with this because I thought that would be necessary, because usually it sticks. But I found when I made these last week that I really didn't need to, as long as I floured my board and I floured my pin. So I'm flouring the board now with the same spelt flour that is in the dough. And then I'm just flouring my pin a bit as well.
Alison, what is grease-proof paper? Is that wax paper or parchment or something
parchment
else?
In the States. I think it's parchment in the States.
Thank you.
Sorry, we call it greaseproofing. Oh,
yeah,
no, Annie.
It's something in between wax paper and parchment paper.
Thank you.
It's not waxy, but it's like it has a coating that you don't want to actually heat necessarily. Well, some people don't like to heat it.
Okay.
There's no wax paper in the UK.
No, that's true. I really struggled to find wax paper here in Italy. I had to go and order it online because I couldn't find wax paper here. Okay, so I'm just rolling it out, and it's I'll try and look, you can kind of see there what sort of thickness it is. I'd say that's maybe 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters. Dust off some of the flour, and I've got a little girly, a little gingerbread girly, and I've got a more boring circle as well. Now I'll do a couple of gingerbread girlies, and of course, as we know, it's best to just get them as tightly in as possible so that you have less dough to roll up and roll again. What I found with the dough being sticky is if you find it's too much like that, you can put it in the fridge for an hour or so, covered, and it will make it more workable. So if it's sticking to things, you have the option of doing that as well. But you can see that just with the flour here on my board, it's not sticking at all. So there we go. So what I'm going to do with these is I'm going to put them on a baking sheet that I know I don't need to grease them because I know my baking sheet's fine. And then I'm going to pop them in the oven at 180 C, which maybe someone can translate into F for me because I'm a centigrade part of the world. And I'm going to cook them probably for 8 to 10 minutes. And what I've noticed is you should take them out before they start to look brown, otherwise they will burn.
really watch them carefully because they go from cooked to burnt extremely quickly. If you've got an oven that's got one bit that's warmer than another, try to turn your tray round halfway. And what you'll find is, if you do a recipe like this with no eggs and no dairy, you'll have a cookie that at the beginning of the period is really snappy. So this, when I originally made it, would have snapped really like a ginger snap in the UK. But if you leave it, this has been left in the fridge for a few days. If you leave it in a fridge or in a tin, it will get softer and softer. And that's what I've learned the Lebkuchen do. So don't be deterred if you cook yours and you think, oh my gosh, my teeth are going to break. Because if you leave it a couple of days, it will get softer.
Allie?
Okay. Yeah.
Allie, for 300 grams of flour and 300 grams of sweetener, how much fat would you use gram-wise?
So this recipe is 250 grams, and I use 16 grams of lard. Okay. So if you can work it up from that, it's not that much, but yeah, okay. it gives it it makes it softer and not so ridiculously hard. And the flavour is nicer because obviously fat brings out flavour in everything. So that little bit of lard in there, and you can't taste that it's lard. You know, obviously if you want to use butter, but you can't taste a lardy flavour in it. It's just like lardy cakes. You can't taste the lard.
Okay, and the 180 Celsius is 356 Fahrenheit.
Thank you. Okay, I'll leave that there. So what I wanted to show was the other thing that I did with the dough, which is I've been making a rye spice bread in my kitchen for years now with sourdough discard. And I absolutely love making it. I love the rye, and I love the fact that I make it not too sweet, and I love the fact that it uses sourdough and it just rises. And I read probably about 6 months ago that a rye spice bread was made in France traditionally and matured for months. And I remember getting very excited about it and trying to read and research, and then just coming across recipe after recipe in French, which don't speak. I have enough trouble speaking Italian, let alone French. So I kind of stopped there and just carried on making my normal rye spice bread with the sourdough discard. And then when I saw Annie's post, this is what kind of pulled me in, because I thought, oh, maybe I could use that dough to make a rye spice bread with. So as well as doing my one with spelt and chestnut that I showed you in the cookies earlier on, which they are, I just want to show you these. They are, oh, okay, being enthusiastic. Bear with me a second. Okay, there we go. So those are my little gingerbread ones ready to go. To go in the oven in a minute. As well as doing that, I put another dough down, which was rye, whole grain rye, and then 4/5 honey and 1/5 molasses, because molasses is such a lovely flavour in a rye spice bread. So I decided to include that as well. And then I knew that I wanted to do something with sourdough, because before we made these cookies, I didn't have any baking powder in my kitchen, because I don't really like using baking powder. I naturally turn to sourdough. So I thought I really want to try something with this dough that raises it using a discard, not using any form of kind of baking powder or baking soda. And I wanted to make it more bready, because I remembered as a kid in England eating a gingerbread made by, I think it was made by Lyons, the company, Lyons, and it was treacly and sticky and bready. And I thought, I really want to try and make something that's kind of not as sweet as that, because my tastes have changed and I don't eat things that sweet, but something that had that kind of feel to it. So what I've ended up with is I will show you a cut slice of this. I hope you can see that all right. And this is squishy and moist. It's got raisins in it. And it's been baked in a sandwich tin. So it's part of a circle kind of sandwiched in. It's gingery, it's spicy, it's not too sweet because I didn't add any extra sugar or any extra honey or sweetener other than the fermented dough. I actually added extra flour, so it's less sweet than the dough is. And I just wanted to tell you before I talk through how I made this a little bit about the French rye spice bread. So in French, spice bread is called pain d'épices, épice meaning spice in French, and pan bread. And it was traditionally made in Rheims, which is interesting based on what Annie said, because her recipe that she worked on originally, that ended up being biscotti, has the Rheims in it. So it obviously comes from the same tradition in the same city. And in the 16th century in France, this spice bread was just all the rage, and the French court absolutely loved it, to the point where in 1571, the bakers of pain d'épices were given a royal charter. So they were an industry in and of themselves in Rheims. And they made it using rye originally. And interestingly, it had no ginger in it. So it had other spices in it, but it wasn't a gingerbread. And then they mix the dough up and they leave it in wooden troughs for months. And as far as I can tell from my research, there was no other leavening added at all. They just left it and it raised itself. Later on in the history, Dijon, the other city in France, took over the pain d'épices recipe. They had a more of an industrial way of making it, and they changed to wheat. But traditionally it was rye, and I much prefer rye. I don't use wheat in my kitchen. I use spelt and rye and a few other gluten-free and buckwheat sometimes. So I wanted to make it with rye. And there was one other bit of trivia that I found out, which I thought was quite interesting. In the Alsace region, which is kind of between France and Germany, there's a museum that is dedicated to pain d'épices. I've never been, but I think it would be fascinating to go to a museum dedicated to a rye cake. So moving on to my recipe, it really was an experimentation. It's just what Ellie was talking about. The dough kind of gives you the option to take it and use it in different ways. So I've made the cookies with it, with a spelt version, and then I've moved to thinking, oh, can I make a bread with it? And I'm going to talk you through kind of what I put in the dough, but I mixed it up earlier because I use my food processor and it's very loud and I didn't want to have it on the call. You could do it by hand and I'll explain how. I didn't soften my hard initial dough. Obviously, we talked about putting it over water. So you could soften it and do this by hand. I chose not to soften my dough, to break it into pieces and to put it in the food processor. You need quite a strong food processor to do it because, as you know, if you've made that dough, it's quite hard. So I've got my food processor here because I literally mixed it a little bit earlier. And I'm just going to change my camera here to make sure that I can see, that you can see what I've got here. Yes, you can. Okay, that's excellent. So the recipe is on the handout, which we'll make sure you get, so you don't have to worry about copying anything down. And what I've got in here is 250 grams of the fermented original dough, which was 50-50 rye, whole grain, and a sweetener, 4 parts honey, 1 part molasses. I've got 100 grams of sourdough discard, which was also whole grain rye. I've got 70 grams of whole grain rye flour. Then for my liquid, I used almond milk, which I made myself by just soaking almonds overnight, draining them and whizzing them up in a blender and then sieving. I get milk to put in this, and then I get what I call almond muff. That's what my son calls it, to have on breakfasts. That's what the liquid portion of this is. And then the spices in here are, this time, a teaspoon of cinnamon, some nutmeg, some cloves, some anise, some allspice berries, lots of ground ginger, more than I put in the cookies. And then I also put in here a tablespoon and a half of grated orange zest. That makes it a little bit more moist, which is good when it's baking, but also gives it that lovely flavour as well. And that's all literally been whizzed up. And my food processor jumped around a little bit as I did it, but it's all right. And I'm going to put in 60 grams of raisins. I did try. This is the fourth time I've done this. The first time was a little bit too dry. The second time was a little bit too wet. The third time was really quite good. And then no one in the house is complaining that there's a fourth time. So there's a fourth one to eat. I'm mixing in the raisins just as they are. The second time I did it, I soaked the raisins in some water kefir because I thought it would help keep it really moist, but it ended up being too moist. So I decided to go back to just the raisins from the packet. So I'm just mixing those in. And then I've got an 8-inch sandwich tin, which I've greased with lard and also put a liner in because I've had too many occasions with rye spice breads where it's stuck to the bottom of things. And if you've got such a lovely cake, it's so disheartening when it sticks to the bottom of something. So I'm literally, as you can see, it's sort of a fruit cake consistency, the way it's kind of coming out. And I'm just going to pile that all in. Again, this is just a blank canvas, really. I mean, you could add other flowers in if you wanted to. You could add various spices in. You could add candied peels in it. You could add the almonds in it. When I've, the years that I've been making my spice bread, I've literally put in whatever I fancied each time, and it always comes out tasting really amazing. So when that's all in, all I'm going to do is level it off, and then I'm going to let it ferment because obviously this has got sourdough starter in it, and that's what's going to do the raising for us. And so what I will do, usually if there's space between the level of my dough and the top of this pan, I will cover it in something, sometimes cling film, and let it rise. If I think that the dough is going to come over the top of the level of this tin here, then I will use a fly screen and tent this, and then put damp tea towels over the top of that tent so the top of it doesn't dry out. And then I leave it somewhere warm to ferment. And in our house, my husband set us up a DIY proofing setup rather than paying hundreds of pounds for a proofer. It's a heating element and it's got a little switch on it, and I put it in my oven. That's the space I use because I don't have any other space, and I can set it to a temperature that I want it to be. And so I will leave that in my DIY proofing box to ferment, and when it's 75% risen, I will put it in the oven, again 180, which I think Amy said was 356 Fahrenheit, 180 C. And then I bake it for 35 to 40 minutes. And it's kind of a judgment when it's done. The temperature was 98 last night when I made the last one, when I made this one here. And as you can see, it's so moist, so delicious, not too sweet. If you want it sweeter, you can add in some extra molasses or honey. You could ice it, dust cinnamon on the top, even put some alcohol inside it as well. It's really, really beautiful. And I'm so pleased that Annie posted the dough originally, because it kind of been my mission for a little while to get a spice bread that was more authentic, and I feel like I'm getting there with this. And so it's kind of made my Christmas, this recipe.